Okay, welcome to our second lecture on environmental justice and Indigenous people. The picture you see there is Uluru, the location in Australia that I mentioned as an example of co-management in the previous lesson. So in this lecture, we're going to pick up on a few themes that kind of follow on from some of the stuff that we learned about in the last lecture. So we're going to talk about the idea of paternalism, then we're going to address decolonization, and then we're going to talk about the differences and compatibilities of Western science versus traditional ecological knowledge as sort of forms of knowledge or ways of knowing about the world. So, to start off, talking about the idea of paternalism. So, paternalism is when you're doing something for someone or making someone do something for that person's benefit, but without their consent. So if someone, if you're doing something for someone or doing something to someone and they've asked you to do it or consented to it, then, that wouldn't be paternalism. That would just be helping them out, or making a deal with them if you're getting something out of it too. And if you're doing something to someone or for someone for your benefit, and they didn't consent to it, then that would be just, hurting somebody or exploiting them or something like that. So paternalism, you have to have both of those sides. Right? So it has to be something that the person didn't consent to. Right? They didn't say that it was okay, but that you're doing it for their benefit, not for your benefit or someone else's benefit, but as a major, necessary justification of it that the person you're doing it to, the person whose consent you don't have, is going to benefit from it in some way. So the term comes from the Latin word for father, because paternalism is basically the way that we often treat children. Parents often have to make a child do something that the child doesn't want to do, wouldn't consent to, for the child's own good. Lots of kids don't want to go to school, don't want to eat their vegetables, don't want to go to bed at bedtime, all of these kinds of things, but parents make them do this stuff because it's for the kid's benefit. And so when the kid grows up, then the kid might look back and say, well, I'm glad that my parents, had me eat my vegetables because, I did in fact grow up healthier. And when I was a kid, I wouldn't have been able to understand that that was necessary, or I wouldn't have had the kind of ability to make short-term sacrifices of eating something I didn't like for a long-term goal of being healthier or whatever. Right. So we generally think that there's paternalistic things that parents, it's okay for parents to do to children. So that's why we use that term to describe this in general when it might be applied to people who are not children. And then I also have a note there that we should keep in mind that paternalism is very commonly used as a rationalization for something that's not actually motivated by paternalism. So a lot of times when people are, exploiting somebody else, they'll come up with a rationalization that claims it's for that person's own good. We're going to be talking about colonialism in a little bit in this lecture. And there were a ton of paternalistic rationales that colonizer countries came up with to justify why they needed to go conquer other people and rule over them and take their resources and stuff. They're really good at coming up with paternalistic rationalizations, but that was clearly not the actual reason they were doing it. Right? It was a rationalization. It was something they came up afterwards to try to justify it. So, when somebody's claiming paternalism as a justification for something, you kind of have to look, is this actually even paternalism? Because the question of whether paternalism is justified, you don't even need to get into that if it's just a rationalization for something that's being done for non-paternalistic, exploitative or whatever kinds of reasons. But there are things that are done out of genuine paternalism, a genuine desire to benefit the person that you are doing it to, even though that person is not consenting to it. So the arguments that you might give in favor of acting paternalistically towards someone would be, first, maybe you're not able to obtain their consent. Maybe things are happening too fast for you to go through all the process of talking to the person, getting them to agree to their consent. So in one of the readings, it uses the example of someone who's just about to step onto a bridge that is faulty and can't support their weight. You don't have time to explain to them so that they can make an informed choice about whether they want to risk that bridge or not. You have to just kind of grab them and shove them out of the way. And that's something normally would not be a thing that's okay to do, right? They're not consenting to be shoved out of the way, but you didn't have time to gain their consent. You're just going to trust that after the fact they're going to be okay with it once you do have time to perhaps explain the whole thing. Paternalism also is often invoked when the recipient, the person that you are doing stuff for their benefit, is poorly informed or manipulated in some way. That they've been given bad information, that they are not able to really fully exercise their ability to freely consent to things. Because when we talk about consent, we often think, well, consent needs to be well informed, freely given. And so if someone is misinformed or being manipulated by someone, they're not in a state to be able to give that kind of consent. And so the consent that they might give, right, the things they may say about what they're okay with having happen to them and what they're not okay with having happen to them, aren't coming from a place of genuine agency over their lives. And so that might justify someone acting paternalistically, somebody doing something to them for their own good, even if they think it's wrong. And that's the kind of situation that you run into a lot with children. Children, don't have a full understanding of the world. Especially very young children aren't able to think in complex and sophisticated ways about their lives. And so that's used as a justification of why you can be paternalistic towards children. But the same thing can get invoked with respect to adults that might be in a situation of not being able to really give that same kind of consent. So another classic example that often gets used here has to do with smoking. So if someone is addicted to nicotine, then they're being essentially manipulated by that addiction. Right? They don't have maybe the ability to truly make free decisions about whether or not to smoke. They're stuck with it because they have this addiction, and so that is often used as a reason to paternalistically force people to stop smoking. Right, take that option away from them because it's good for them to not smoke, to not get lung cancer, and so forth. But they're not able to. They're not truly making a free decision in continuing to smoke because the addiction is compelling them to do it, and so they're not making that free choice. So that's the way that paternalistic treatment could be justified, right? The kinds of ways that you might argue that paternalism towards somebody is a good thing. But then there's arguments against. So we don't want to try to act paternalistically towards everybody that we might encounter and always do to people what we think is good for them, even if they don't agree. So one of the key arguments against paternalism is that it removes the recipient's autonomy. The recipient is not able to make their own choices, which is a thing that we often think is valuable in and of itself. Right? It's a good thing to be able to make your own choices, to decide how your life is going to go, to be in charge of your own life, even if you might be making suboptimal choices while doing that. Even if you are making a bad choice to eat food that's not good for you, the autonomy that you have in choosing your own food, not having some expert nutritionist tell you what you have to eat, that can be a thing that's valuable that we think is important to preserve. So the importance of individual autonomy is one of the major factors that weighs against paternalistic action, even when we're very sure that paternalism would improve someone's quality of life overall. That their autonomy is also an important value. And then there's also the fact that an outsider who proposes to act paternalistically may not actually know what's really best for somebody. That they don't have the full set of information. They don't have the full understanding of, what is enjoyable or not to that person, for example, or about their values that they're trying to prioritize within their life, or about the details of how their personal situation and circumstances work. Outsiders always have, or generally have, less information about what a person's situation is like. And so even purely from a point of view of promoting the best outcomes for someone, the most benefit in their life, the person giving or not giving the consent is often in the best position to figure out what the best route is. So if these considerations that weigh against acting paternalistically. And the reason that we're addressing this topic in this lesson about Indigenous people is that Indigenous people are very often treated paternalistically by non-Indigenous governments and advocates and activists. There are lots of people out there who are not Indigenous but are pretty sure they know what is going to be best for Indigenous people. And so they will act in paternalistic ways towards Indigenous people. So a lot of the things that governments have done to forcibly assimilate Indigenous people into the non-Indigenous mainstream, for example, has had paternalistic justifications given for it. That, well, it's better for people to give up their traditional cultures that are viewed by non-Indigenous people as primitive or unsuited to the modern world. And so it's going to be good for them to get assimilated. It's going to be good for them to get integrated into the capitalist market economy instead of, other ways of life that they had been practicing. It's good for them to learn English and give up on their other languages, all these things. So there's paternalistic justifications given for that kind of treatment. But you also see paternalism from the people that would be appalled by that kind of thing and see themselves as advocates for Indigenous rights. That environmentalists, for example, will often claim to be advancing the interests of Indigenous people by, for example, expanding wilderness areas and putting natural resources kind of off the table for economic development. But Indigenous nations don't necessarily agree with that. They don't necessarily think that that is the best thing for them. They may want access to those lands for various sorts of uses. They may want to develop those resources in certain ways, but these non-Indigenous activists and advocates may not listen to that, or may reject those claims because they think that they're acting on behalf of what's really good for the Indigenous communities that they're addressing here. So it's important to be aware of paternalism and to be careful about making paternalistic arguments, to really think through the issues of whether in this situation paternalism is actually justified or not, and whether paternalism is being exercised towards one group of people in a way that it wouldn't be exercised towards another group of people. So Indigenous people are targeted for paternalism in scenarios that where it wouldn't happen to a non-Indigenous group, because there are stereotypes about Indigenous people being primitive or childlike or unable to run their own affairs in the same way that other people can. And so that opens the door to greater degrees of paternalism being carried out by non-Indigenous people. And so we want to be careful that we're not going to fall into that that the unequal application of paternalism, or treating certain groups as less able to make their own decisions for themselves about their own lives and futures. Okay, so then moving on to the second topic to address here is the idea of decolonization. So this is a term that's been getting a lot more use and attention among both academics studying these issues and activists and advocates and so forth trying to work on these issues in outside of academia. And so, very simply, decolonization means undoing the effects of colonialism. So colonialism, primarily by European countries, has enormously shaped the world that we live in and is kind of the reason that we even have this distinction of indigenous versus non-indigenous people. Right? If we didn't have colonialism going on, we wouldn't need to wouldn't have this divide between some people being indigenous and others not being indigenous. And so colonialism is when one nation or country takes over another area in order to benefit the colonizer, in order to extract some sort of resources or wealth or benefit from the colony to benefit the colonizer. And there's in very general terms, two different ways that colonialism can be carried out, or two different types of colonialism, and so therefore, in very rough terms, two general types of colonies that you might get. And so these are called settler colonialism and extractive colonialism. And so extractive colonialism is probably the more common one around the world in terms of land area impacted, is when the goal is just to extract these resources, right? To take wealth and resources from the colony to benefit the people of the colonizer country. And so in an extractive colonialism situation, you get very few people from the colonizer country actually moving to and settling in the colony. You get just a small group of people who are there to kind of run the show, but the population of the colony is going to be primarily made up of the indigenous people of that place, or the people that were already living there that have been conquered and taken over, and or people that are brought in as laborers, often forced labor or slavery of some sort. You see that in a place like India, for example. India was a British colony for about 2 centuries. Only a very small number of British people ever actually moved to India, and even fewer of them settled there permanently and raised their families and so forth. So the vast majority of the population of India has remained, the native Indian people, right? The people whose ancestors were in India before it was a British colony. So India was an extractive colony. The goal of the British in India was to take resources from India to boost the British economy. And so that's an extractive colony. Then the other way that you could do colonialism is settler colonialism. And so that's what we have in a place like the United States. Settler colonialism involves large numbers of people from the colonizer country moving to the colony and settling down there. So it becomes a destination for migration from the colonizer country. So in the United States right now, when you look at our total population, it's something like 1% of the US population is Native American. There's another 15 or so percent, I should have looked up the exact numbers before I started doing this, of the population is black, so people that were brought over as enslaved labor and their modern descendants. Then the vast majority of people, though becoming less the majority in the United States over the last couple hundred years, have been people of European, especially British origin. Right? So these are settlers, people that came over from the colonizer country to live in the United States permanently. And so that creates a different sort of situation when you have this very large population of people from the colonizer country, even after you might have political independence like the United States acquired. That creates a different sort of situation for indigenous people than in an extractive colony where there's hardly anybody from the colonizer country that moved there or continues there post-independence. So for decolonization to happen, to try to undo the effects of colonialism, you can do that on several different levels or in several different aspects. So one form of decolonization is political decolonization. So this is where the sovereignty of the colonized nations is recognized, that the colonized people are given control over their own political affairs, or take control over their own political affairs, depending on the process that leads to political decolonization. And this is, a complicated question when you have a settler colony. Okay, so when the British left India, that left the government of India in the hands of Indian people. All of the people that became part of the government of independent India were Indian, because there were hardly any British people living there. Whereas the United States becomes independent, but the government is totally dominated by people of British descent, and later broadly, other European descent. The United States is now recognized as a sovereign, independent nation, but the indigenous nations within the United States did not get that kind of recognition. The Lenape people and the Haudenosaunee and the Cherokee and so forth didn't become fully politically sovereign as a result of the British backing off. They remained under the domination of this now independent settler colony government. Another aspect to decolonization is what we call material decolonization, which is restoring land and resources to the colonized people, having the colonized people regain control over those things. And so you can have political decolonization without material decolonization if the colonizer country and or their settlers retain ownership of the bulk of the land and resources. And so we see that in a lot of really clear cases of political decolonization without material decolonization in Africa. So in a place like Zimbabwe, you had only a very small white settler population. It was another British colony there. This very small white settler population in Zimbabwe when it finally gained its political independence from Britain. And the government of Zimbabwe became primarily made up of African people, because they were the majority of the population there. I think the population is something like 10% white, 90% black in Zimbabwe. Roughly those numbers. So the government became primarily run by African people, but the small group of settlers controlled most of the land in the country. They still owned the vast majority of, especially the good land, like the really productive farmland. So you had political decolonization, independence of the country without material colonization. You had, the large black majority population still didn't have the land and resources that had been taken from them back when the British first took over the area and created the colony. So restoring that land and resources to the colonized people is this material dimension of decolonization. And then you've got ideological decolonization, which is removing colonial ideas and culture from the colonized people. Because when you have a colony, the colonizer will very often try to essentially re-educate the people of the colony into the culture of the colonizer. I try to assimilate them into the colonizer's culture, teach them the colonizer's language, teach them the colonizer's religion, teach them the colonizer's way of thinking about the economy and thinking about politics and so forth. Often under a sort of paternalistic rhetoric of education and uplifting people, but they'll impose their own culture on the people of the colony. And so even though people might have political independence and or even recover their material resources, if they're still thinking like the colonizers, if they still have those ideologies in their head and they haven't recovered their own autonomous culture, then you could say that decolonization is still incomplete, that removing the ideological dimensions is also an important dimension to decolonization. So you see a lot of debates in some areas about, for example, should we continue using the languages, speaking English or French or whatever it is, or Spanish, because those were languages that were imposed on a group of people by this colonial power that ruled over that area. Should we continue to practice Christianity because that was brought in and kind of imposed on us by the colonial rulers, or should we try to, create our own religions, recover pre-colonial religious traditions, and so forth? So we have, multiple dimensions to decolonization. And the emphasis on these different ones will kind of swing back and forth like a pendulum, because people will sometimes focus a lot on one of these dimensions, and then somebody will realize another dimension is getting kind of left behind. And so at the kind of current moment in history, especially when we're talking about decolonization with respect to indigenous people in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, there's a concern among a lot of activists that the pendulum has swung too far towards focusing just on the ideological dimension, and getting rid of colonialist kind of like ways of thinking and so forth. And people are forgetting that decolonization also has material dimension of recovering access to land and resources. And so the slogan that you'll sometimes hear to capture this idea is land back, and I've got it there as a hashtag because you'll sometimes encounter it on a lot of social media. People say, hashtag land back. The idea is that, you can talk all you want about ideological decolonization and getting rid of colonial ways of thinking, but that only takes you so far if indigenous people don't actually have a, material base for themselves in actually having control over land that was taken from them. And one of the ways that this idea manifests is a sort of further critique of the idea of land acknowledgements that I brought up in the previous lesson. So it's becoming more common in many places to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're on, and pay your respects to the people whose land you're on that was unjustly taken away from them. And it's good to recognize that. It's good to understand the history of where the land you're on came from. But there's a certain question that can easily be raised then. If you're saying, well, I'm on land that was stolen from X people, then somebody can say, well, if that land was stolen from those people, shouldn't you give it back to them, right? If you're just going around saying, well, I acknowledge this thing is stolen, usually we'd say, well, if you acknowledge it's stolen, you should give it back. And so, if you're going to acknowledge that you are on, unjustly taken indigenous land, then shouldn't we be working towards giving that land back to the people that it was unjustly taken from? Okay, so then our third topic that I want to address is the contrasts and compatibilities between Western science and indigenous forms of knowledge. And in the title on the slide there, I've got Western in parentheses because there's a lot of debate about whether the term science should be applied to indigenous knowledge systems. So should we define science very narrowly so that it only applies to things within this Western cultural tradition growing out of Europe, in order to emphasize the differences between this particular form of knowledge associated with Western culture and indigenous forms of knowledge? Or should we define science very broadly to cover, essentially all valid knowledge about the world, and therefore apply it to indigenous knowledge and essentially, complement indigenous knowledge by calling it a form of science? And so you'll see people taking both sides of that kind of debate, right? About whether it's more useful to define science narrowly in order to distinguish Western science from indigenous forms of knowledge, or whether it's more useful to define science in a broad way that covers multiple different valid knowledge forms. And so I'm kind of dodging that issue a little bit here by always using the expression Western science to talk about that particular tradition of knowledge. So, some of the issues arise here because practitioners of Western science and people that make use of that, people from Western cultures, that is European-derived cultures, have a very long history up through the present of dismissing the traditional ecological knowledge that's held by Indigenous people and calling it a myth or a superstition or primitive or not valid unless it has been validated by Western science, right? That it's only a guess, or that it's has no real basis. And because of this history of this very negative view taken towards indigenous knowledge by scientists and other people within this Western tradition, we have then a lot of skepticism of science by indigenous people who have felt like that their knowledge of the world has been, repeatedly insulted, denigrated, and dismissed by non-indigenous people. And science has often been used to justify harms being done to indigenous people. Science is used to claim that their land management practices are harmful and ineffective, and therefore the land should be taken away from them. That they are sort of more primitive or lower kind of human being. So there was a lot of scientific racism for a very long time. That the idea of there being clear racial differences among groups, like on a biological basis, was something that was regarded as science, as established scientific knowledge for a very long time, and then was used to justify harms towards indigenous people, used to justify taking their land, used to justify trying to assimilate them into Western culture and so forth. And when I talk about this kind of stuff, it can be very easy to say, well, that was in the past, that was, obviously we know now that that was bad science, right? And it's true that like a lot of that scientific racism, like we now recognize, well, that's bad science, right? That's invalid, scientifically invalid, right? It's invalid on science's own terms. But I want to just put in a note of caution here that it's easy to say that in hindsight. It's easy to look back at what people were saying in, the 1920s and say, well, obviously now, 100 years later, we can tell that that was bad science and they shouldn't have been doing that and shouldn't have been using that to justify these harms. The question is, are there things that are being done now in the name of science that another 100 years from now we might be looking back at and say, well, obviously that's bad science. Those people just, weren't applying science correctly, and so that doesn't count as like a bad thing in the scientific tradition. How able are we to recognize if the things we're doing now in the name of science are invalid and or harmful to people? And so we want to have a certain amount of humility about our claims to knowledge, because there's such a history of bad things being advanced under the claim that they are scientific fact. We also have the issue that even when the science itself was valid, right, that it was saying correct things about the world and how it works, indigenous people have often been exploited by scientists in order to gather scientific data. And so I've got a few examples there of scenarios where this has happened. So one is archaeology. Archaeologists are always digging up remains of people from the past, and that would include indigenous people. And so we have lots of grave sites that are disturbed, bones that are put on display and subjected to all kinds of tests that those people's modern descendants find disrespectful. They're losing access to the remains of their ancestors if they're being locked up in science labs to be experimented on. We have sacred objects that might be found in archaeological sites that again are taken away, put in a museum, not respected in the way that the descendants of the people that created those things would consider to be appropriate or or respectful. And so archaeologists have very often been doing things in the pursuit of knowledge, which again may be perfectly valid knowledge in the sense of being like true facts about the world, but the way that they've gone about seeking that knowledge has involved disrespect and exploitation towards indigenous people. DNA research is a hot topic right now. There have been a lot of cases of DNA researchers who are doing things like trying to reconstruct the human family tree, right? See how different populations of people branched off of our early common ancestors and migrated throughout the world and created the different populations of people that we see in the present day. And you may have seen some of these diagrams, the maps of the arrows coming out of Africa and, across Siberia and into the Americas and those kinds of things. Those are based on DNA research, and there's other DNA research done for medical purposes and trying to figure out treatments and therapies for various sorts of conditions. And these different kinds of research will often involve taking DNA from indigenous people. You can't trace their evolutionary history and back to the common ancestors. You don't have their DNA for various other conditions that we might want to do medical research on. You often want a very broad, diverse database to work with so that your conclusions aren't just applicable to one group of people, but that DNA is often collected from people in unethical ways, that researchers will make promises to people about the use of that DNA, like which research projects are we actually going to use that DNA for, and how is that DNA going to be stored, who's going to have access to this information, right? All this kind of medical privacy stuff. Researchers will often make all kinds of promises to people that are not followed through on, that DNA that was samples that were taken for one research project get used in a different research project that the person that the sample came from didn't consent to and wouldn't consent to, right? They wouldn't agree that that is a thing that they want their information used for. So that's created a lot of controversy and a lot of hostility by indigenous groups towards researchers that come in and want to propose taking samples and doing some sort of research, because they've been burned so many times by researchers who lied to them, misused information, and so forth, and got all kinds of benefits from it. Got patents that they made money off of, got promotion and tenure at their universities, and acclaim for their publications and stuff. And those benefits haven't come back to the communities that they obtained their data from, the people that they took these DNA samples from. And then the last example that I've got there is the idea of bioprospecting. So you've probably heard the idea that, one of the reasons that we should care about biodiversity in a place like the Amazon rainforest is because by studying the plants there, we may be able to find cures for all kinds of different diseases. There are all kinds of compounds that might be found in a very biodiverse place that could have all kinds of useful medical and other applications. The way that research is done is often by going to a place like the Amazon and talking to the practitioners of traditional medicine there, going to an indigenous group and saying, hey, can you show us some of the plants you use to treat this or that medical condition among your own people? And then these scientists will take samples of that plant. They'll be able to isolate the active compounds in it and synthesize them in a lab, or figure out how to grow this plant on like a plantation or something like that in order to use this as a drug to cure whatever it is that it's useful for. And so that's great for the people that again get tenure and publications and stuff out of this research, and it's great for the companies that might make millions of dollars off of producing these drugs, but the benefits aren't flowing back to the people that knew about this plant in the first place and pointed it out to these researchers that came in and now are profiting off of this. So that process of learning about traditional knowledge from people and then going and profiting from it without sharing the benefits of that back with the people that you got that knowledge from, that's what bioprospecting involves, and it's a major issue in highly biodiverse areas, especially ones that are more remote from where these scientists may be based out of, and so they may be a lot more reliant on this traditional knowledge to point them in the right direction for plants that might have a possible medical application, since there's thousands of compounds in each species and thousands of species there, and so forth. And then the last major source of conflict and reason that indigenous people are often suspicious of science is that we also have a lot of cases of scientists, quote unquote, discovering things that indigenous people already knew, and that we could have known by just asking the indigenous people without having to wait for science to quote unquote discover it. So as an example, a few years back we had the first scientific documentation of birds actually picking up burning sticks from a wildfire in Australia. These are specifically hawks. They would pick up burning sticks from a wildfire and then fly over and use that stick to light fires in other places to flush out prey. So, if you light some grass on fire with this, and then all of the little, mice and marsupials and stuff that live in that grass will run out of it so that they don't burn to death, and then the hawk could swoop down and catch them. And this, fire-based hunting, that's something that, we've known humans have done for an extremely long time, as the standard use of fire in hunting and gathering societies is to flush game out of areas. And indigenous people in Australia had been saying, well, some animals like hawks do this too. And Western science had been saying, no, that's silly. Hawks aren't smart enough to do that. They can't actually do that. You're just anthropomorphizing these animals. And then, lo and behold, the scientists finally caught it on camera and said, "Oh, wait, I guess this is true." And a lot of the indigenous people in that area had kind of forehead smacking moment. They're like, "Yes, we've been telling you. We've been living here for 40,000 years. We've seen it happen. We know about this, and you just didn't think that our knowledge of the world was valid. And so, if you're not willing to listen to us on these kind of things that we clearly know something about, then maybe you don't know so much about the world." So here I've got a chart showing what are often presented as some of the key differences between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, right? Because these are not just different in their content, right? One knowledge system says hawks can light fires, and the other system says or said that they can't. And it's not just the content, the facts about the world that they contain that might be different. It might also be their approach to knowledge, right? What does it mean to know about the world? How do we learn things about the world? And so on this chart, this is, keep in mind, this is a very simplified chart, right? This is giving you some general ideas of what some of the differences might be like. Don't treat this as a strict dichotomy where everything's always, to opposite ends of the spectrum, but that these are tendencies. Western science tends to be one way when traditional ecological knowledge tends to be another way in many cases. So to go through these, so Western science is very focused on finding universal laws, things that are going to be true everywhere for all time and in all places, and so things like, Newton's laws of motion in physics and stuff are kind of, classic examples, right? Force equals mass times acceleration for every mass everywhere in the entire universe for all time, according to Newton, right? So it's a universal law, whereas traditional ecological knowledge is often very place-based. It's knowledge about how things work in a particular part of the world where the people holding that knowledge are living. It doesn't necessarily claim to be valid for all places and all times. It's relevant to the place that you're in. Next one, Western science tends to be very quantitative, and those of you that have taken a lot of science courses have run into this. Depending on whether you like or dislike math, it's been a good thing or a bad thing for you, but we use a lot of math. Newton's law there is a mathematical equation. You can plug information into those variables and calculate the unknowns. And a lot of times, if you can't quantify something, if you can't put it in numbers, science considers it to not even really be real. It's not a real piece of information about the world if we can't quantify it, can't measure it with numbers. Whereas traditional ecological knowledge tends to be more qualitative. And there's less math in traditional ecological knowledge. There's less interest in, building regression models or doing calculus to figure things out. Western science tends to be experimental, that we try to set up an experiment to isolate specific variables in order to pin down their exact relationships while controlling for everything else, whereas traditional ecological knowledge tends to be experiential. It's based on the experience of living in this place for many, many generations and building up this long-term body of understanding rather than having, the one critical experiment that proves your theory, the way that science often aspires to. And related to that, Western science tends to be analytic, tends to want to break things down, tends to want to isolate different variables to look at their effects on each other while keeping everything else constant. Whereas traditional ecological knowledge is more often holistic, tries to encompass all of the relationships that are involved in a place all together without separating out one thing from another. Western science tends to aim at control of the things that we're learning about. Once you know the laws of motion, you can design machines that will operate in a predictable way. And on a much more complex level, if we look at climate science, right, where our goal with climate science is to build models, quantitative models of the Earth's atmosphere that are sophisticated enough that we can first predict the exact ramifications of different modifications we might make, like changing our level of CO2 emissions, and then to control those phenomena by adjusting our CO2 emissions in order to get the outcomes that we were aiming at, to control the rise of temperature, for example, by, putting sulfates into the atmosphere to reflect solar energy, or by reducing fossil fuels, whatever interventions we do, we're trying to control the state of the atmosphere, and our science helps us to figure out exactly what things are going to produce what results for us. So Western science is very much about being able to control the world that we're studying. Traditional ecological knowledge tends to be about finding ways to cooperate with the world around us, to develop mutualistic, cooperative kinds of relationships with other entities in the world, with not exerting control over them, but finding a way to live with them in a mutually beneficial sort of way. And then the last thing I've got on the list is that Western science is, at least in theory, open to all. So it can be very hard to learn things about science. The science courses are difficult. They can be expensive to, get a degree and learn all of the scientific information that's out there. There's discrimination within the scientific community on the basis of gender and race and so forth. There's all kinds of practical barriers to learning the things that Western science can tell us about the world. But at least in principle, if you learn a scientific fact that comes from Western science, that's a good thing. That's appropriate. Nobody's ever going to come up to you and say, you're not meant to understand quantum physics. You shouldn't have learned about quantum physics. Right? If you've managed to understand quantum physics, and I will admit that I haven't, despite reading a bunch about it, my brain just doesn't quite catch on. But if I managed to learn about quantum physics, nobody would ever come and tell me that knowledge isn't meant for you. You shouldn't know that. And it'd be inappropriate for you to share that knowledge with other people. Whereas with traditional ecological knowledge, there's often restricted access to certain information about certain aspects of the world, that it may be based on, a certain gender or a certain clan or something may have special ownership over a certain piece of knowledge, and it's not meant to be shared with everyone. It's not meant for everyone to know and to pass on to other people. And there have been some scandals where anthropologists have gone and studied a certain group of people and have been given access to certain knowledge that those people have, and then the anthropologist goes and writes a book and says, hey, Group X told me X, Y, and Z. Here's all of their knowledge that they gave me. And those people are like, whoa, dude, you weren't supposed to tell that to everybody. you went through like an initiation process, for example, and it's so we trusted you with that information, and now you're just going and blabbing it to everybody. That's not a story that's meant for everyone who is idly curious about the world to know that piece of information. And that's often one of the tricky things when people within the scientific tradition are trying to work with holders of traditional ecological knowledge and share and integrate knowledge, is that a lot of the things that they may be granted access to are not things that they can then go share with everyone and anyone that comes along and is interested in it. That's not to say all traditional ecological knowledge is restricted like that. Right? There's plenty of stuff that is open to anyone to know if they're interested. But the point is that not all knowledge is like that. Whereas within Western science, again, there's lots of practical barriers to learning lots of scientific information, but there's no kind of moral barrier. You're never in a position where somebody is like, you are not meant to know this scientific fact. So I've been using this term traditional ecological knowledge here to describe indigenous knowledge about the environment, but I think it's also important to have a critical perspective on this term. It's good to know the term because you'll see it a lot, but it's also good to be a little bit critical of it because, as the anthropologist Paul Nattersee said, traditional ecological knowledge is neither traditional nor ecological nor knowledge. So he objects to all three words in this term, not because they're totally invalid, but because they can be very misleading if we take the term at face value. So first, traditional can imply something that's static and located in the past, right? This is things that we've just inherited from our great-great-great-grandparents, unchanged, not being adapted to new circumstances or being added to or anything. It's just this fixed body that has been passed down from generation to generation. That's not true. These traditional knowledge systems are living traditions. They are constantly being updated and adjusted and rethought to deal with new circumstances. So they're rooted in traditions. They are, not based on, well, people in the past had no idea what they're talking about. Glad we finally figured it out. That's that kind of storyline comes up a lot in scientific contests, right? I'm so glad we got rid of the phlogiston theory and these other bad things, geocentrism, all that kind of stuff. Traditional knowledge is, rooted in and respectful of the things that are inherited from the past, but it's not fixed or static. It's always evolving and being added to and adapting to circumstances. Then the term ecological could imply that there's traditional ecological knowledge and then there's traditional non-ecological knowledge as sort of separate areas of study, in the same way that in science we've got environmental science that tells us about ecology, and then we've got other areas of science, right? We've got astrophysics, and we've got exercise science, and all these other areas of science that are separate from environmental science, because the environment or ecology is just one domain that we might have knowledge about. But in traditional ecological knowledge, you don't have those kind of sharp separations. You don't have ecology as this one domain distinct from all the other domains of life that you might have knowledge about. All of these domains are integrated. All traditional knowledge that indigenous people have is ecological knowledge in some way. It's all connected. It's not a distinct body of ecological knowledge as opposed to non-ecological. And then third, the term knowledge can imply something that exists in your head or in a book, that you can write it down, that you can record a YouTube lecture about it, and there's the knowledge. It's in the lecture, it's in the book, it's in your head, and that's what the knowledge is. But a lot of the knowledge that indigenous people have is integrated with practice. You can't know it separately from doing it. You can't sit in a lecture hall and learn indigenous knowledge about caribou, for example. The only way to really get that knowledge about caribou is to actually go out and see the caribou herds and track them and hunt them and so forth. And it's only by the practice of actually engaging with them that you truly get the full knowledge. So it's not something that can be separated from life and put in a book or on a website or whatever, and just kind of remain there. So if we use or see this term traditional ecological knowledge, we want to keep in mind the way that those terms could potentially mislead us about what we're really talking about. Okay, so from all of this, you may be getting the impression then that we've got science over here and we've got indigenous knowledge over here, and they're totally different things, and that indigenous people have no interest in science and think that it's all, exploitative and a scam and false and all this kind of stuff. But that's not the case. That is not a universal thing, and in fact, indigenous people very often are very interested in the scientific tradition and the knowledge that comes from science, as long as that doesn't come at the expense of indigenous knowledge. As long as they're not forced into a one or the other must choose sides kind of situation, indigenous people very often find a lot of value and usefulness in knowledge coming out of the Western scientific tradition. And so the title on this slide are two different expressions that I've seen from different indigenous groups describing the value of combining indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. So, I've heard the situation of using both kind of knowledge as being described as being as strong as two people. Right? So you've got two different people's sets of knowledge, and you're going to combine them, and it's going to sort of double your strength. Or another expression that I've seen is seeing with two eyes. Right? So you've got two different eyes and two different knowledge systems, and when you think about your eyes, right, each eye sees a slightly different view on the world. Right? If you sit and close one eye, close the other eye, you have slightly different perspectives on the world from each of your two eyes. And so in the same way, indigenous knowledge and Western science can give you two somewhat different but complementary perspectives on the same world, right? Because your two eyes, you're seeing the same thing, and your brain is able to integrate those two visions to give you 3D vision. So in the same way, you get a more robust picture of the world if you're seeing it with both indigenous and scientific or Western scientific eyes. So my first bullet point is kind of what I was just saying, right? Indigenous people don't necessarily reject science or don't reject all science because there's benefits to combining different sorts of knowledge. And by the same token, scientists working within this Western tradition need not reject indigenous knowledge. And there have been lots of cases in which new insights have been gained for scientists from listening to indigenous perspectives, from taking on indigenous ideas about the world and incorporating those alongside the material that they're getting from the Western scientific tradition. So these traditions can be brought together. They can be, become compatible and be held together by people. You don't have to necessarily take one or the other, but you have to do it right. You have to be respectful of both sides. And given the power imbalance between indigenous societies and non-indigenous societies that are the home of the Western scientific tradition, that really comes down to respecting indigenous people and their knowledge on the part of these scientists who have the ability to choose to ignore indigenous knowledge. And it's a lot harder for indigenous people to ignore science even if they wanted to. And so there's a big effort among a lot of both indigenous and non-indigenous researchers to do science for, with, and by indigenous people, so that science isn't something separate from indigenous people and their culture, but it's being done for, with, and by indigenous people. And there are good case studies and bad case studies out there. And there's cases of this failing in practice and being done poorly, and there's cases of it being done well if you start to look into the things that people have written about these efforts. So some of the key things to keep in mind that might make one of these projects go well is, so first is the idea that Indigenous people should be involved in defining the question. So that's the very first step of a research project, right? The very first thing you got to do, you got to define your research question. What is it that you're trying to know? What knowledge is valuable to you that you're going to try to get out of this this project? And if Indigenous people aren't there helping you to define the question and deciding what is actually a priority for us to know, then you've already kind of left them behind. You've already made this a project that Indigenous people are being kind of sidelined from. And if non-Indigenous people are the ones that come up with the research questions and then approach Indigenous partners. So you have cooperation from the get-go, from the very first step, and so that involves either cooperation between non-Indigenous scientists and Indigenous people, or that can involve Indigenous people who are themselves scientists. Right? There's plenty of Indigenous people that have gotten scientific degrees, been trained within the Western system, and so if they can bring their own Indigenous perspective to defining their research question, not let non-Indigenous people kind of define the questions for them, then they can kind of take the first step there. The second bullet point that I've got there, a second important thing to remember, is that non-Indigenous researchers that may be involved in some project need to be accountable to the Indigenous communities that they work with. So if you remember the examples I gave of researchers, lying to people about why they're taking certain samples and what they're going to do with them, or maybe they thought they were telling the truth at the time, but later they came back and said, you know what, we've got all this DNA on file, let's just use it for this other project. They'll never know. Both of those things would involve a lack of accountability. The Indigenous people whose DNA is being used in that project didn't have the ability to say, hey, there's got to be some consequences if you are mistreating us. And so being accountable to the Indigenous people that you're working with, whose knowledge and data is being used in this project is very important. And then the last point that I've got there is that many Indigenous nations now have formed their own institutional research board to approve research projects that involve their people, their culture, their land, their data, etc. So if you've taken the research methods class, you've learned all about the IRB that exists at Slippery Rock, which is a panel that looks over any research that involves human subjects, any research that involves, surveying people or doing tests to people and stuff, to make sure that that research is being done ethically, that you're not exploiting people, taking advantage of them, harming them in your research. And so Indigenous nations have created their own IRBs because there are ethical elements to doing research with and for Indigenous people that a non-Indigenous IRB, like the one at Slippery Rock, might not be aware of, might not know about. And even if the Slippery Rock IRB was really good about all that stuff, an Indigenous nation may want that authority over their own research. They may want to be able to review it and not have to trust some other institution to get it right. And so, many of the nations, especially the larger ones that have been subject to a lot of study by outside researchers, have created these IRBs or equivalent organizations. And if you don't get their approval for your research project, then they won't allow it to proceed. And so that ensures that this research is being done in a way that is not going to be harmful to their people. So those were the other points that I wanted to touch on about Indigenous people in environmental justice. And so we'll be moving on in terms of our major topics next week, but we'll continue to see case studies involving Indigenous people as we go through the rest of the semester. So this material will come up again in the future. So I will see you in our discussion.